This podcast contains explicit content and is intended for mature audiences. Listener discretion is advised. Don't say we didn't warn you.
Hello, my name is Madison, and you are listening to, or watching, preferably watching, Who's Knocking, a true crime podcast. Yes, it's close to Halloween. It's nearly Halloween. As you can see, I have decorated. So it's festive around here. We're festive. And I'm drinking an orange drink. So, ta-da. So today's podcast is sponsored by my newsletter, Grim Weekly. And if I haven't shoved this down your throat enough, actually, to be honest, I keep forgetting to plug it in the beginning and I keep plugging it in the end. And I bet not all of you make it to the end. So I'm just going to say right now, if you are interested in signing up for my newsletter, which is called Grim Weekly, you can do so at grimweekly.com. There's one M in Grim Weekly. It's spelt the English way. And the newsletter is really just a little collection of things true crime related that I have found over the week. There's some news, there's some recommendations, be it documentary, book, YouTube video, podcast, what have you. Some of them are old, some of them are new, some of them are borrowed, some of them are blue. And, you know, just me kind of writing something up every week and sending it out. So far, was that a knock at my door? Who is knocking? I don't think so. So far, I've really been enjoying doing it, and I have been getting some pretty good feedback, just saying. People have been saying nice things. It is free. You can unsubscribe at any time. And I just think it's a good way, it's a fun way for me to interact with people and stay in the true crime know. I mean, I'm always just like knee deep in true crime, so this is just me going about my normal day and then kind of putting it out there. So if you're interested, go to grimweekly.com and sign up. Make sure that if you do sign up, you receive the confirmation email, which generally goes to a junk box or something, which kind of sucks, but it is what it is. That's the rules. So I think I will just get straight into it. So this episode, I was actually perusing the net for different documentaries, and there are so many good documentaries and like old ones. Like there's just so many. Specifically, it was looking on Crave because I was like, I hadn't been on Crave in a while, and I wanted to look for some good recommendations for Grim Weekly. And I found this one, and it's actually quite new. It's a 2021 documentary miniseries, 4 episodes, Showcase. And I don't know what Showcase has to do with HBO, but I think they're connected in some way. I don't know. And this was a 4-part series on a case that happened. I guess this would have taken place in like 89, 90, the brunt of it. And this was super interesting, the whole scenario that unfolded. So I'm doing an episode. It's going to be a 2-parter because there's quite a lot of information here. So I think I will just get into it. And this is really like, did George Franklin kill Susan Nasan? That's, I guess, the story, because it's not like, you'll see. I'm just going to go for it. Ready? So Sigmund Freud is the originator of the concept of a repressed memory, or repression, really. He claimed that repression of a memory could occur when the thought of that memory was too painful for a person, so that they push that information out of their consciousness into, I guess, their subconsciousness. And at the time, Freud did not conclude that these repressed memories could later be recalled, rather that they sat in the unconscious mind and then could then affect a person's present behavior. For example, if somebody was, say, bitten by a dog when they were a young child, they could then repress that memory of being bitten by a dog and then not really understand why later in life they had a phobia of dogs. So hopefully that makes sense. But that was his main theory, and it kind of got pushed to the side That idea has really morphed a lot over the years, and now the field of psychology often debates the idea that one can repress and then recall a memory later in life. So today, Siren, I will talk about an example of this theory in practice, and this is the story of George and Eileen Franklin. So the story starts many, many years ago, and it begins with Susan Nasan. So Susan Nasan was born on September 27th, 1960 in Foster City, California. Now, Foster City was a relatively new kind of planned community located in San Mateo County. It's pretty close to Silicon Valley in that kind of region. I think it's kind of off an inlet, and so like very coastal. And Foster City, being a new development, was home to many young families just starting out. It was a nice place to live and raise children, very family oriented. Susan was an adorable little girl. She had red hair and freckles, which unfortunately made her a bit of a target for bullying. This is going to be 1969, so she's about 8 years old. She's almost 9. She has a best friend, and her best friend is Eileen Franklin, and she also had red hair and freckles. So they at least had somebody to share this experience with, and they kind of both were a little bit outcast together, but at least they both, were experiencing the same thing. Susan was very shy, but very sweet. She was shy because she was bullied, so it's kind of like, it's kind of sad, but she was very caring and thoughtful towards others, which is really what led her to venture out on her own on September 22nd, 1969, literally days before her 9th birthday. Now, that day after school, Susan noticed that a classmate of hers named Celia had left a pair of tennis shoes behind at school. And Susan decided to take those shoes home and return them to Celia because she knew that Celia lived very close to her. And she just thought, hey, that's the right thing to do. Nice. I'm a nice girl. So Susan went home and she asked her mother if she could go and return the shoes. This was, of course, during a time when it was completely normal for an 8-year-old child to roam the streets unaccompanied. You could send little kids to the corner store to get you a pack of smokes, and nobody so much as batted an eye. I was walking down the street today at the time where it's like lunchtime and all the kids at the high school or middle school, whatever school, get out and they're like all at Dollarama, which is the dollar store in Canada. And like this one kid's coming out, he's like, they wouldn't let me buy a lighter. Like literally, they ID kids to buy lighters. Like, you used to be able to send a 6-year-old child like blocks away to a convenience store to buy you cigarettes. That was the norm. Look how far we've come. And debatable whether or not this is good or not. But very different time. But super fascinating that that's changed so much. Anyway, so you could do this. And Susan's mother, Margaret, had no problem with this. Why would she? So off little Susan went. Several witnesses that day say that they saw Susan carrying a brown paper bag containing the tennis shoes. Nothing out of the ordinary. But time began to pass and Susan did not return. Margaret began to worry. She called Celia's home to see if Susan had stayed there. Maybe she just decided to play with Celia. She's 8 years old. But they hadn't seen her, and Celia also was not home. Margaret was actually kind of relieved hearing that information, as she figured that the two girls probably just found each other outside and decided to play. So she asked Celia's mother to send Susan home if and when she saw her. But more time began to pass, and this again began to worry Margaret. So Margaret got on her bike and she drove around the neighborhood looking for her daughter. When she stopped by Celia's home and talked to her family, during that time that she was talking to her family, Celia arrived home, and she said that Susan had dropped off the shoes hours ago and had left. So Margaret, hearing this news, was terrified. She went right home. She informed her husband, who had just gotten home from work, that Susan was missing, and they both searched the neighborhood together, and when they could not find her still, they called the police. The police began searching. They asked her father, Don, to come in and to take a polygraph test. He immediately agreed and passed with flying colors. The next day, there was a 200-person search party out looking for Susan. There was a dive team and search helicopters. And now there was this one very interesting lead that came in from a girl who said that the week before, she had been approached by a man in a blue station wagon who offered her a ride. The car had cardboard boxes packed in the back, some dolls on the passenger seat, and a gun on the floor. So this was fishy, and the police obviously were very intrigued by this lead. And then the next week, 2 girls had run in to the same man in the station wagon, the blue station wagon, with the exact same description. And they, I guess, knowing that this person was on the prowl, took down the license plate number. Smart friggin' cookies. You guys, always be aware of license plate numbers, because you could freaking solve a case that way. I believe it's actually during the Manson murders that there was, I don't really recall, but there was somebody who like noticed a suspicious car and wrote down the license plate number. If you can do that, if you ever see something suspicious, take down the license plate number. Why not? Fuck it. It could save a life. So anyway, so these 2 girls, they had the same run-in with the same station wagon. They took down the license plate number. The police then found that man because of the license plate number, and they were able to search his home and polygraph him. And they found nothing, and he passed the polygraph. So he was probably just your local sex offender out for a jaunt. But anyway, everybody was up in arms. They really wanted to find little Susan. It was really rare that something like this would happen in this community. So everyone was, obviously terrified. Her parents were a mess, of course. They were just hoping and praying that whoever took her was keeping her alive. They just really, really wanted to get their daughter back. So finally, after about 10 weeks of Susan remaining missing, in early December, a San Francisco Water Department employee stumbled upon Susan's decomposing body. There she was, laying right near the Crystal Springs Reservoir, which was just off of Highway 92. She was found underneath an old box spring mattress, and it was clear from the state of her remains that Susan had been bludgeoned to death. I believe it would have been mainly skull and a hole in her head. And some sources even said it was mummified remains, so it would have been mid decomposition. Susan had other cuts and abrasions. She had a silver ring that she wore on her finger, and it had been completely crushed. Now, despite Susan's family's pleas for help and the offering of a $20,000 reward and a whole community's desire for answers, Susan's case soon grew cold. It was not until about 20 years later, in 1989, when Eileen Franklin Lipsker remembered something. Now, we are going to go to November 17th of 1989, when a call was made to the police by a man named Barry. Barry claimed that his wife had witnessed a murder in 1969 and she wanted to report it. Barry said that she was reluctant to come forward because the murderer was a family member and she feared retribution if he did not end up in prison. There were a few more calls with investigators before the woman was willing to give her full name. At first, the woman identified herself only as Eileen, and this is what she had to say during the first call. So, the information that she gave them was the following. She said that she had been inside the killer's van when they picked up Susan across the street from her home in Foster City. The 3 of them drove to the woods out toward Half Moon Bay. Eileen stated that it was a pleasant autumn day. After the killer stopped the car, he raped Susan in the back of the van. After the rape, Susan was sitting outside on something elevated, like a tiny hill or maybe a rock, approximately 15 to 20 feet away from the van. Eileen claimed that the killer then struck Susan on the head with a rock. She said that Susan raised her hand to her head before the killer landed a second blow with the rock. Eileen could not really remember Susan's clothes, but she said she might have been wearing a dress. She said the killer did not remove Susan's dress to rape her, he just hiked it up. Eileen also said that the killer made her help him put the mattress over top of Susan's body. And after she was all covered up, the man proceeded to shove Eileen's face into the ground and told her that if she ever told anyone what happened, nobody would believe her, and that he would say that she was part of it. The killer then told Eileen that he would kill her if she ever told. So after giving those details, Eileen said she would give further details if the ones that she had just provided were found to be consistent with the case files. The detectives took this all in, they went in and they found the old case file, and they found that everything that Eileen said was consistent with the case. They looked at the newspapers and media that were in the case file and determined that there were details that Eileen gave that only somebody who was there could have known. Okay? The detectives told Eileen that they believed her, but they did warn her that they could not guarantee a conviction, only that they would only bring these charges if they were sure at like a 90% chance or above that they could get a conviction. So they're basically saying, we don't know that this can get a conviction, but we'll gather information, and only if we're like really sure that we can go to trial and win will we notify this person and charge them. So she's like, okay, I can live with that. So with that, Eileen finally gave her full name, which I told you before. It was Eileen Franklin Lipkin. I think it's Lipkin. And she agreed to an in-person interview. And that is where she named the killer. And she named her own father, George Franklin. Dun dun. So, let's start with Eileen. Who the fuck is Eileen? Here's a little bit about her. Eileen was child number 3 out of 5 in her family, smack dab in the middle. She was George's favorite child, her father, perhaps because she seemed to very physically resemble him. She had red hair and freckles, just like he used to have red hair and freckles. Eileen also really loved George and thought he was super smart and super cool and handsome, and she like really looked up to him. He often would take Eileen out for one-on-one outings, and he made her feel very special, especially given the fact that Eileen was like a red-haired freckled kid with buck teeth who like, she says that everyone said she was ugly, but like her dad made her feel really special. So this was like, I'm going to say cute now, but we'll take it back later, little relationship. Eileen was the type of kid, she was a middle child, okay? No offense to all you middle children, but she's very middle childy, okay? Us oldest children have our quirks too, but I don't know. I love birth order quirks because I find them to be so accurate. Anyway, Eileen was the type of child to tattle on her siblings and create a lot of drama within the household, which in a way kind of isolated her and brought her closer to George. And Eileen, and like we'll get into a little bit about that a little bit more later, but Eileen also had problems at school. As I said, she was Susan's best friend. Susan, we talked about how she was kind of bullied at school. Eileen had the exact same problems. She was made fun of for her red hair and freckles and buck teeth, and at school she had very few friends, one of them being Susan, another fellow ginger. Another was another girl, I forget what it was, but she had a disability. Like she was, they were the kids who got made fun of, very unfortunately. When Eileen was in high school, she also still had a hard time fitting in, but Eileen began to use this like weird offbeat status as a way to find herself a group of friends, and she's like started a little like misfit friend group, and they like kind of did their own thing, and they did a lot of drugs and really leaned into their oddball ways, drank and did drugs and stuff. So not the best crowd, but I mean, it's high school, you do what you do. Now, Eileen was very focused on money from a young age. She never finished high school, which is something that she seemed to be very embarrassed about later in life. But regardless, she went on and on often about making money, wanting money. She apparently, according to others, was very determined to marry somebody who was wealthy. And in the end, she did accomplish this goal with her husband Barry, who was quite an accomplished something or other, I forget, maybe a consultant or something, but he made good money. Now, Eileen's parents ended up getting a divorce when all the kids were between the ages of 14 and 17. So that, is hard. And George began a new relationship immediately with a 22-year-old girl who already had 2 kids. The kids, including and maybe even especially Eileen, remained close with their father over the years. And she would go on to say that the new wife, that Eileen was the one who visited the most. And now that is this story is it comes in layers, okay? So that's a very simple layer. We're going to really layer on top of this. I'm trying my best to kind of do this chronologically, but this story did not come at me chronologically, so, let me know what you guys feel about this narrative and if it really makes sense to you. So that's a little bit about Eileen. And now we're going to go back to the second interview, and I'll take you back to 1989. This is now the second interview that the detectives do with Eileen. So the detectives flew down to Southern California where Eileen was living. And they did a second interview in person where she would give more details. So the details that she gave were as follows. She said that the vehicle was a Volkswagen van. God, there are so many sirens. She said that when they picked up Susan, her father was driving her and her sister Janice to school. When they picked up Susan, George made Janice get out of the van. No explanation there. And to those who are really listening, you already see a discrepancy here. George told the girls that they were going to play hooky that day, and Eileen said it was possible that this happened around lunchtime, not in the morning. But it was either in the morning going on the way to school or in the afternoon on the way to school back from lunch. Still a discrepancy. Eileen also mentioned that the mattress was larger than a twin-size mattress. Eileen said that once they pulled over the van, her and Susan were playing in the back on the mattress, jumping around. Later, Eileen was in the front seat and Susan was on the mattress. And that's when George joined in with Susan on the mattress and ultimately pinned her down, hiked her dress up, and began to rape her. And she describes it as like he was like humping her, like really disgusting, absolutely foul to think about. Eileen said that George exited the van first, followed by the two girls. She said that she then saw her father holding a rock above his head with two hands as such. She said that Susan raised her hands up to her head as George crashed the rock down against her head where her hands were. And then he struck her a second time with the rock. The rock crushed the silver ring that Susan wore that had a stone in it, is what she said. Eileen then said that they drove home without Susan, that she didn't want to go. She said she didn't want to leave Susan alone because she would be scared and cold. And she said this to her father, and her father just ignored her. Eileen said that when she got home, she went up to her room, and then Janice, her sister, joined her. She said that she may have told Janice what happened, but she couldn't remember. Apparently, during that interview, Eileen admitted that she had been in therapy during the past 20 years and admitted that these memories began to come to light during some of these sessions. Eileen also said that her memory had very recently become much more vivid instead of vague. She said that she had gone to her family with these memories and that her mother, Leah Pelufo, had concluded years before that her father was Susan's murderer. Apparently, Leah had actually confronted George with these accusations before. The detectives then asked Eileen if she had ever undergone any sort of hypnosis during her therapy sessions. Due to some confusion in the detective notes from after the recording turned off, it's unclear whether or not Eileen told them that she had once thought about undergoing hypnosis for weight loss and didn't, or that she had undergone hypnosis for weight loss. Whether she had thought about it or she had actually done it, but only for weight loss purposes. Either way, they concluded that she had never undergone hypnosis for the purpose of recalling repressed memories. The detectives were definitely attempting to vet Eileen. They wanted to see if she would make a good witness, as at this point, she was the only evidence that they had pointing to George Franklin. And they concluded that she was very reliable. They felt that she was very articulate, she was consistent, she did seem genuinely reluctant to start shit. Like, she didn't seem like she wanted to be there. It seemed like she genuinely like had these memories and was like, well, I have to do something about it. You know, she didn't want to stir shit with her family, but she felt she needed to. And this to them was a sign of her being genuine. There was one part of her story that did not match the original story. So for those of you listening, good on ya. And that was the timeline. So police knew that Susan Nasan had gone to school that day. and that she hadn't disappeared until after school and after she had returned the shoes to Celia. But Eileen said that her father picked up Susan on the way to school. And even after she changed her story again, she said it could have been after lunch. This would only put it at midday and would have meant that Susan was not there for the second half of school, but we know for a fact that she was. When the detectives asked Eileen if she was sure that the pickup had taken place in the morning or afternoon, as she now said, she said she thought so, but she couldn't be sure. And this still just did not really jive, but this was a 20-year-old memory, and memories can be flawed. Now, detectives went on to ask Eileen what her home life had been like, wanting to know the type of guy that George was. So here's a little bit about George. Buckle in. So, George Franklin was born in 1939 in Virginia. His father, Onus, was a very nasty man who beat and terrified his family. Now, George was the youngest child, and he was the only boy. His mother, Hattie, loved her only son, and she and all of his sisters just doted on him, and he got treated like the youngest and only boy. George was apparently a very rough little boy, but he was spoiled rotten by the women in his life and was rarely punished by them. The father was another story. I think he sounded pretty nasty. Now, George seemed to grow up to be a bit of an arrogant asshole. He was very interested in the military and would eventually go on to serve for about 7 years. Now, one summer while he was living in San Bruno with his sister, George met Leah DiBernardi. Leah was quiet and she was not very popular. She had a very poor relationship with most of her family. Her mother was not very nice to her, and she often compared her to her younger sisters, who were apparently much better looking than Leah, which just sounds awful. Now, George, and Leah was apparently like super smart. She would because she was so allegedly ugly, she spent all of her time studying and doing well in school. So she had quite a bright future ahead of her until she met George. So George met Leah at the grocery store that he was working at as a bag boy, and the two started seeing each other, and Leah decided, very unfortunate for Leah, she decided to marry George right after high school instead of going to college on the scholarship that she'd already earned. Now, their relationship was very flawed from the beginning. The couple, Leah, got pregnant before the actual marriage, which very much outraged Leah's very Catholic family, and George did not like that her family seemed to really look down on him. The couple had their first baby and named her Kathleen, and after that, George finished his high school degree. And after his time in the military, he got a job as a firefighter and also started a house painting business on the side. George, had a lot of he was a lot of things, but one thing he was a hustler. He was a provider. Okay, a lot of other flaws though. In his personal life, George was really starting to go off the rails. Leah was continuing to have children. She had a child every single year. And George was just drinking very heavily. He was being super mean. He was a nasty drunk. And he started sleeping around with anyone and everyone. Some people thought that George was some sort of sex addict based on his very obsessive behaviors in regards to women and sex, but I think it's very possible that he was just an asshole. He was really, he would have sex with every woman and then be like, oh, she's such a whore. And it's like, he was pretty much the largest whore you could be. And he also did not hide any of this from Leah. In fact, he rubbed it in her face constantly. After 5 years of marriage and 5 children, my God, George began to beat Leah. He was a huge piece of shit to her, and he called her awful names and was just a complete asshole to her. George was very hot and cold with his children. Sometimes he was super nice to them, taking them on little trips and buying them gifts. And then sometimes he would just beat the shit out of them for no apparent reason. Now, the children, there were 5 children. It was girl, 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 boy. As you know, Eileen was in the middle. I think it was Kathleen, Janice, Eileen, Diane, and then George Jr., the boy. Very interesting because George was also the youngest boy to all sisters. Fascinating. I just love birth order. I love like comparing. It just like, it makes such a difference, I find. But that's a story for another day. Anyway, so as I said, he beat his kids. He was super shitty, and alcohol really seemed to be like the biggest factor there. They all recall that he was very nice when he was sober, but as soon as he started drinking, he got really mean. And he would do things like, you know, they would be sitting at a table and he would like start asking them questions, and then all of a sudden like he didn't like the answers, so he would get really mean and beat them. Or like someone would be sitting at a table and he'd just walk up and like slap them in the head. And it's like, it is so, and I, you know, from all their accounts, like it's so confusing for young children when parents just like come out of nowhere, and it's like because they're drinking, but you as a 7-year-old kid don't understand what drinking is and how that affects you. It's just like completely random behavior, and then like you're being punished for things that the parent is saying, you did this, so I am punishing you, and like you didn't know it was wrong, and there's no way for you to learn from these things or learn how to adapt to that behavior if it's just so random. So, you know, you have to understand, like, and I don't understand because this is not the way that I grew up, but what I've started to gather as I've done a lot of cases on parents who are super abusive is everyone reacts very differently. And it's like, it's almost like you're living in a war zone as a child when something like this happens. It's like it's so random. And how do you ever prepare yourself when you have no idea that like what mundane thing that's going to come out of your mouth that's going to piss off somebody to the point where they raise a hand to you and they're like 3 times the size of you. You can't begin to exaggerate how horrible that is. Especially, you know, I don't have any perspective on this, but I do have children, and thinking that people could behave like that towards their children is disgusting. It's horrific, and it should never be tolerated. That's my piece. So later in the marriage, like beyond this 5 years, Leah began to like completely withdraw. She let go of herself. She began gaining a lot of weight. She started drinking a lot, and she was very absent with her children, which again makes sense. Like you don't want to be attractive to this type of person who's beating you and beating your children. Like you want to be as far, like you want to make, a lot of people, it seems that they like make themselves like super repulsive to that person so that that person will leave them alone. Apparently she spent some time in the late 60s in and out of some mental institutions, being put on and off different mood-altering medications. She received electroshock therapy at a time and treatment for her mainly depression. Leah and George's behavior obviously affected their children in a very negative way, and each child seemed to react very differently to the abuse. But one thing is very certain, the entire family was extremely dysfunctional. And how could they not be? So the detectives, after learning all this, started interviewing some of the other kids. So they sat down with Janice. Now, Janice was Eileen's older sister, and she said that George was very abusive. She thought that her dad hated their family, and she just did not understand why. That was her perspective. She just didn't understand why he was such a dick to them. So Janice said that George also, here's another layer. She said that George began sexually assaulting her in the 3rd grade, and in the 7th grade, George began actually raping her. Apparently, George was raping and sexually assaulting all of the girls. It's unclear, but at least 3 out of 4 of them. And really beating on his one and only son, George Jr. And this fact seems to be quite consistent among all the children. Janice had suspected that George murdered Susan Nasan as well, and she had actually gone to the police with this allegation in 1984. So that was kind of a weird thing to come up. She said that on the day that Susan went missing, back in 1969, George was home at around 4 o'clock, 4:15, and was acting weirdly all day, or like all night after that. The police who took the claim in the 80s, in 1984, noted that Janice's statement actually gave George an alibi for the crime. And so they didn't take the investigation any further. That to them was enough for them to be like, okay, well, if he was home at that time, then he could not have done it. Is that fair? Janice now also said that she had no memory of being in the van that day or of seeing Susan at all, which kind of contradicted Eileen's story. Even though Eileen and Janice had some conflicting points in their testimonies, there was enough that matched that the detectives decided to keep going. After all, remember, these were 20-year-old memories, so they were bound to be a little bit sloppy from what we know of memories and eyewitness testimony. Detectives were able to confirm that George had not been at work on the day of the murder in 1969. That's pretty much all they had in terms of his alibi, is that he didn't have one. They did more research into George's life after Susan's murder, and here's what they found. In 1978, George's drinking habit got worse, and this caused him to get a second divorce with the 22-year-old he married later in life. He got to be super annoying at work because of his drinking and constant smoking weed, and he was really shitty to all the guys and ended up getting into really bad relationships with all of them. Nobody really liked him. And then he got an injury on the job, and he was awarded $1,000 a month on disability, and so he left his job as a firefighter. He still kept the painting job, though. Meanwhile, Leah had gotten her shit together after leaving George, and she actually went back to school and got a law degree, which is pretty impressive. So clap on the hands for Leah. And in 1989, when the detectives showed up at George's home to ask him about the murder of Susan Nasan, George asked only 2 questions before lawyering up. 1, am I a suspect? 2, have you spoken to my daughter? And then he lawyered up. He was arrested on the spot, and only then did he deny the allegations. The police at the time had a search warrant for his home and vehicle, and searched his home and vehicle. In his apartment, they found tons of pornography. Okay. A lot of it, although not technically child porn, was porn that depicted young girls or girls meant to look underage having sex. Yuck. And there was other weird shit like swingers magazines and magazines on bestiality. And I'm just saying, one of those things is clearly way more fucked up than the other, but I'm just trying to give a full picture here. And then they also seized a box full of different sex toys. And a lot of them were like really small, or perhaps you could say child-sized. Disgusting. So this was a huge red flag, obviously. And detectives began to reach out to other women that George had been with sexually over the years, of which there were many. And some of them, more than one, multiple, said that George had some really creepy shit to say to them regarding their own daughters. Stuff like how he thought young girls should be introduced to sex early, perhaps by their own fathers. Disgusting, foul, gross. And this type of thing, they heard from multiple women, as I said. So this was not an isolated event, and many women said this not knowing each other even existed.
Female companions that he had over the years.
And what did they tell you?
Well, a majority of them told us that he was involved in that type of thing and wanted them to get involved in it with the animals, with their daughters.
In one instance, he solicited an older woman to provide her 9-year-old daughter for his sexual desires.
So I just find this particularly freakish coming from a man with 4 daughters. Just saying. So George Franklin was booked on suspicion of first-degree murder. The whole story did not take long to make it into the media. And Barry, who is Eileen's husband, if we recall, was loving it. Loving it. And he started booking Eileen to do like interviews in media. And when this happened, Eileen's story began to change a little bit. It was only now that Eileen started telling people that she had only recently begun remembering bits and pieces of the murder. Before, she said that she like vaguely remembered it, and that it was more that she was keeping it to herself because she feared her father. But now she was more saying that it was like, it's all coming back. It just like all like recently started coming back to me. 1 month before this, Eileen had told her mother that she visualized the murder while under hypnosis. Okay? Remember, she had said that she did not. So that was getting a little bit sketchy, especially with all the media. It was like she was jumping the gun a little bit. So the police then also interviewed Kathleen, the oldest daughter, who goes by Kate. And Kate also had a lot to say about Eileen. Kate was the oldest child in the family, and she had left the family as soon as she possibly could. She couldn't wait to leave behind the abuse and dysfunction. Her way of dealing with things, like, so remember the other sister, Janice, she was like really confused by everything, and she just couldn't understand it, and like, you know, she didn't really react in a certain way, but like that was her perspective. Kate, on the other hand, like, her way of dealing with all this was like being as far away as possible. When she could be out of the house, she was out of the house. When she had to be in the house, she was in her room. She just tried to keep away from everything as much as she possibly could. So with the second she was like turned 18 or whatever, went to school, she was gone. When Eileen called Kate to tell her about what was going on, Kate was immediately skeptical. It was her opinion that Eileen was still the same shit disturber that she had been as a child, and she was still desperate for attention from the family. So, you know, she kind of brushed her off. But Eileen was also like, she described Eileen as being very like she would like freak out at you. So I think Kate was kind of like, okay, cool, do your thing. Kate was also very disturbed by Eileen's relationship with Barry, her husband. She thought that Eileen in this relationship had just put herself right into a relationship with somebody who bared a lot of similarities to her own father, who Kate knew was abusive. From Kate's perspective, Barry was mean and spiteful towards Eileen, and he talked down to her and got upset with her for paying too much attention to their 1-year-old son, which are giant red flags for any relationship, ladies, and also got upset with her for spending too much money. Eileen had apparently tried to divorce Barry at one point, but he threatened to withhold all of their money, which is really what Eileen was with Barry with, the reason that Eileen was with Barry in the first place. So, you know, that kind of ended the divorce train. Kate said that Eileen initially told her that she had recalled the memory in a dream. Another different story. So Kate wanted nothing to do with this drama and assumed that this claim would be dismissed by the police as soon as Eileen opened her mouth, but there she was very wrong. The police also interviewed George Jr. So George Jr. said that Eileen had told him that she recalled the memory of her father killing Susan while under hypnosis. Then after George was arrested, Eileen called George Jr. and told him that she'd actually recalled the memory during a regular therapy session and asked him to please not tell anyone about what she had told her about the hypnosis. He, not being the biggest Eileen fan either, said that he would not lie for her. And then 2 months later, Eileen called again and said that she had actually recalled the memory during a dream. So after speaking with all the family, somehow the detective still felt that Eileen was a reliable witness, which I think is very interesting. Okay. We learned a lot about the family. What seems consistent from everyone is that George was physically, sexually, and emotionally abusive to all members of his family. He did not sexually abuse George. There are no allegations that he sexually abused his son, but I'm saying like he was 1 to 3 of all of those things to everybody in the family. Most of the kids, and maybe especially Eileen, did not understand that this was not normal for a very long time. Eileen was the favorite child, which I think especially blinded her from seeing her father's actions as wrong. Later in life, there were clear divides within the family. There were like little alliances, kind of. It seemed that Eileen and Janice were very close and almost developed a little alliance against George that originally Leah was supportive of. It kind of sounds like Kate and George Jr. both had very similar opinions of Eileen. Kind of thought she was a shit disturber and like didn't really, kind of like played her off. Diane, who I didn't really mention, she was, I think, originally supportive of Eileen, but we'll see later she's not. Doesn't last. The dynamics were very complicated, and I've done my best to try to understand them through my research, but I think undoubtedly it's impossible for any outsider to truly understand all the interpersonal conflicts between 7 different family members. So I'm just saying, like, take what I'm saying as like hearsay. It's very hard to like really understand. And I don't think anybody outside the family can actually truly understand. So up until now, we've discussed everything kind of leading up to the trial and all of the different family members and how their family dynamics worked. I think up until now, you're seeing that Eileen's story, like, she does seem to have conviction behind her claims. She does seem to have like a pretty detailed memory and recollection, or I guess you could say picture of what happened that matches up with what we know happened to Susan. But there's a lot of sketchiness here. She's changed her story a lot of times, and her sibling, like, that's being very evidently called out. In the documentary series, Buried, they interview a lot of the detectives and like the prosecutor, and it's very interesting because they talk, and I guess they like kind of, and I guess the documentary maker is like, doing their thing and like trying to show 2 sides of everything, but they seem to have a lot of conviction in their assertion that Eileen was telling the truth. But we have to remember, there was no physical evidence of George being involved. Nothing. He didn't have an alibi, but that's it. But I think what was very compelling once it started coming out was the allegations from all of his family members that he was extremely abusive and like absolutely a pedophile. So this is where I'm going to stop part 1. And we'll go into part 2 next week. And we'll get into like the trial and everything and what happens after that. Yeah. So I hope you enjoyed that and will enjoy the next part. That's pretty much it. I know this is the parts are going to be like a little bit shorter than they normally would be, but I will say I do suggest watching the 4-part documentary series, but I will say I suggest listening to my podcast first. There is stuff that I've added that it did not come from the documentary, that came from other sources. There was a book written. I'll put it in the source notes. I did not read the book, but I took from sources of people who wrote the book, and the guy who wrote the book was also interviewed in the documentary. But there's also been a lot written about this case for a very long time. It's an old case. So I think you'll get a little bit more than what is in the documentary here, but there's also stuff in the documentary that I'm not putting here for obvious reasons. But yeah, please feel free to reach out in the comments and let me know what you think. Did you know about this case? We'll get a lot more into like repressed memories and recalled memories and stuff in the next episode, but that's what I'm like really curious about and really interested in, especially in this case. But yeah, reach out in the comments. Please check us out on Instagram at Who's Knocking Pod, Twitter, No, Instagram is at Who's Knocking Podcast. I think Twitter is at Who's Knocking Pod. Email at hello@whosknockingpodcast.com. And please sign up for my newsletter, grimweekly.com. That's a really good way to interact with me if you feel like doing that. And that's about it. Please, guys, stay safe out there because you never know who's knocking. This podcast is produced in collaboration with Lost Line Media. Artwork by August Digital. Music by Matthew Cook.